Hi there, thanks for joining us. This is Talking Europe on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson. Now, France and President Macron are gearing up right now for their moment at the centre stage of European politics. The French president giving a major speech on Thursday, outlining his priorities as France is set to take over the presidency of the European Council for 6 months from January. Now, from Europe's borders to its economy, defence to digital, climate policy to workers' rights and more, it's an ambitious agenda. What's more, this all comes as France heads into a presidential election in April 2022, slap bang in the middle of the EU Council presidency. Well, with me to look through some of the president's plans and other big European issues of the week is a French MEP from the France Unbowed Party. She is also co-president of the Left Group in the European Parliament. Manon Aubry, thank you very much for being with us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'd like to start off with you and with our viewers by hearing a little bit of what the president had to say on Thursday. So here's a snippet of President Macron speaking about his priorities.
We need to move from a Europe that cooperates within our borders to a Europe that's more powerful in the world, fully sovereign, free to make its own choices and to be the master of its own destiny. For the first time in a half-century, we face existential questions about climate, technology, geopolitics, and that is what we have been preparing for the last few years, to profoundly change our organisation and to give us a new ambition.
Well, Manon Aubry, I'd like to get your take on that speech on Thursday. Emmanuel Macron says he wants France to take the lead in Europe. He wants to make the EU more unified and more autonomous to act in the world. Those sound like aims that a lot of people in the French political class could get on board with.
Well, that was a great speech, but probably more for the presidential election than for the France leadership and the France presidency of the Council. I think that's a key question that should be dealt with first is, a presidency of the EU is already short, it's only 6 months. It only happens every 14 years, 14 years. And this time it happens in the midst of our national elections. And for French speakers and French people, we all know how important our election, because there's only, one key election every 5 years. And the first question is, why this presidency was not postponed, for example, to the second semester of 2022, where either Macron, either a new president, would have more legitimacy to work on EU affairs, and that presidency would not be interrupted by the election that, in the end, weakened the role of France within the EU.
Well, this is a question that was asked at the press conference. The French president, they say he didn't choose the timing of this EU Council presidency. It's true that the calendar is set out many years in advance.
It's true, but first off, it was part of the previous mandate because it was the minister already. But second of all, it could have pushed for it. And I'm sure, within the organization of the next president, a solution could have been found. And if you look into details into his announcement, for everyone who knows the way the EU works, what is announced is not a program for 3 months. Because again, this presidency will be only 3 months long. It's a program for 10, 20 years. He just gave his whole vision, claiming, is going to save the EU, probably forgetting also his result and what is done in the European Union. For example, pushing for gas and nuclear to be included in green energy. How can you consider gas as green energy? Or for him pushing for austerity counterpart in the recovery plan. This is, what Macron is actually doing at EU level, and this is what he will keep doing as president of the Council.
Well, let's look at a key aspect of the speech that Emmanuel Macron focused on about European defence. The French president looking for more cooperation between EU states on defence matters and raising the possibility as well of joint exercises. Let's hear from the president again.
Il nous faut aujourd'hui entrer dans une phase plus opérationnelle. Définir
To define for us Europeans and our common interests a shared strategy in a world of threats and risks.
Dans un monde de menaces et de risques.
And so we're going to define and together carry out an analysis of these threats, move forward with these new ambitions in the defence industries, carry out shared exercises and define our
De
partnerships.
définir nos partenariats conjoints.
Manon Aubry, there are hybrid threats to France and to its EU neighbours at this point, looking at, for example, cyber attacks or the instrumentalisation by Belarusian authorities of migrants, desperate people, to come into the EU. I think that's widely acknowledged. Given these threats, though, your party leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, in favour, he says, of more European defence, but he wants France to quit NATO. Perhaps a contradiction there, and there are lots of people who might see that as making France less safe, more isolated.
Well, one should be reminded that what NATO is about. NATO is a US-led defense strategy in which you're supposed to defend each other anytime that the country is attacked, including countries like Turkey, with whom we have very different defense and foreign affairs strategy. If you want a true cooperation and peace strategy at global level, there's one framework which is called the United Nations, and that should be the one that should be used instead of putting together the European defense together with the US strategy, which I think is actually one way to weaken the EU. And since it's been talking a lot about sovereignty, which to some extent seems to have become a key word. I do remember a couple of years ago it was not well seen by the right wing and the liberals, but fair enough. I think they did acknowledge that it's important to be sovereign, but at the same time, how can they pretend to defend EU sovereignty when they keep on signing so many free trade agreements with products coming from the other sides of the world, with very low barrier, with very low tariff, and in the end, if you go to your supermarket, you're going to have milk from New Zealand when milk product just around the corner of your house is not sold there. And sovereignty is also about the capacity of the EU to produce what we need, to produce face masks, for example, that we were not even able to produce during the midst of the sanitary crisis.
Just to come back on the defence situation, though, you say that NATO is US-led. US is certainly the biggest member of NATO, but the head of NATO is not an American. Just on another point, the US very much seen by many Europeans as turning away from Europe. There was the announcement of this AUKUS alliance between Australia, the UK and the US, clearly stating there's much more of a focus on China and on the Indo-Pacific region. Isn't Europe right to come together in the way that President Macron is proposing in light of this?
Well, it's clear that the EU should cooperate, but once again, why should we cooperate necessarily to follow the US strategy? And does it mean that we are going to follow the US the next time they're going to take us to a war like they did in Afghanistan? That 20 years later, they did realize that it was probably one of the biggest defense mistakes they've ever done. So again, the question is not who's right or who's wrong. It's like, what's the best strategy to ensure peace inside the European Union, but also to prevent from going on stupid wars on everywhere in the world. And for that, I think we do need to have an EU strategy, not an EU, supported by the US strategy. And we're very far from there. If you take the 27 member states, they have very different foreign affairs strategy, and it's not even an EU competency. Every country has its own strategy when it comes to foreign affairs.
I'd like to move on to domestic issues here in France, Manon Aubry. You mentioned that the French elections are coming up in April 2022. Emmanuel Macron in the polls at this point, the front runner. And behind him, there are the centre-right and then two far-right candidates. In terms of left-wing candidates, there are currently no left-wing candidates polling above 10%, including your party leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's around 9%. Just in the last few days, Jean-Luc Mélenchon ruled out taking part in a a primary among left-wing parties, which could present a unified left-wing candidate. Why would he rule that out when, between them, your party, the Socialists and the Greens, are actually on 20% ahead of Marine Le Pen, for example?
Well, first of all, if you want to be fair, the latest polls, and there was one from this morning, for example, from Cluster 27 that puts Jean-Luc Mélenchon up to 13%. And
that's still quite far away from the likes of Marine Le Pen, from Valérie Pécresse, and even Emmanuel Macron, 25.
Sure, and I agree with that. If we want to get to the second round, we still have about 3 to 4 points minimum to increase if we want to get there. And the best way is to convince people. And, I'm this kind of old school politician in a way, although I'm young, to believe that we're going to convince people with a program. And actually, we're the only ones to have a program in the left. It's about 700 proposals altogether with a radical platform to address social inequalities, to address climate change. And there would be no sense to get together on the lowest common denominator that then would be so weak that would be unable to convince people. So I think that's the challenge for us ahead and in the coming months is, we can't have endless chat about a common candidacy until March. Now we need to campaign everywhere and remind that French politics is not obsessed with the far right agenda, and we can better share wealth, we can change our constitution, we can have climate actions, and that's what we are going to propose for those elections.
All right, ambitious for your party's campaign ahead. Thanks very much, Manon Aubry. We are out of time. Hope to speak to you again as the campaign progresses. And thanks to you for watching the programme as well. Do stay with us. More European news coming up very soon.